The grand ballroom of the Crimson Palace glittered with 1,000 candles, their flames reflecting off crystal chandeliers and casting dancing shadows across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Ilara moved through the crowd like a ghost, her plain gray servant's dress a stark contrast to the jewel-toned gowns and elaborate suits of the nobles who filled the space. She carried a silver tray laden with crystal glasses of blood wine, careful not to make eye contact with anyone as she wove, between clusters of laughing aristocrats. This was her existence, invisible and insignificant, exactly as an Omega servant should be. She had learned long ago that being noticed meant being hurt, and so she had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, of becoming so unremarkable that even when people looked directly at her, their gazes slid away as though she were merely part of the furniture. The palace had been her entire world for the past 8 years, ever since the orphanage matron had sold her contract to the royal household for a pittance. She remembered that day with painful clarity, the way the matron had told her she should be grateful that anyone wanted a worthless Omega like her, that serving in the palace was far better than she deserved. Ilara had been 12 years old, small and terrified, clutching a cloth bag that contained everything she owned in the world. That bag had long since worn to tatters, and now she owned even less than she had then. But she had learned to survive by making herself small, by never complaining, by accepting that this half-life of servitude was all she would ever have. Tonight was different, though, charged with an electric tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. King Cassian had returned from the Southern Wars after 3 brutal years away, and the entire court had gathered to celebrate his victory. Ilara had never seen the king in person before. He had left for war when she was still a child, but his reputation preceded him like a shadow. They said he was merciless in battle, that he had personally slain over 1,000 enemy soldiers, that his alpha aura was so powerful it could bring grown men to their knees. They said he was cold and calculating, that he viewed people as chess pieces to be moved and sacrificed for strategic advantage, that he had never smiled, not once in his entire life. The Omega servants whispered fearfully about what his return would mean for them, whether his already harsh palace would become even more unbearable under his direct rule. For 3 years, his younger sister, Princess Lyanna, had served as regent, and while she was no saint, she was at least predictable in her cruelties. Cassian was an unknown quantity, a warrior king forged in blood and fire, and unknown things were always dangerous for those at the bottom of the hierarchy. Ilara refilled glasses mechanically, her movements practiced and efficient. A beta nobleman grabbed a glass from her tray, without acknowledgement, talking loudly to his companion about how the war had been expensive but necessary, how the southern territories would provide valuable resources now that they had been conquered. She moved on, offering wine to a cluster of alpha ladies who were discussing the king's marital prospects with barely concealed excitement. According to them, Cassian was 28 now and still unmated, which was highly unusual for an alpha of his power and status. There would undoubtedly be a frenzy of noble families trying to position their daughters as potential queens, political marriages that would strengthen alliances and consolidate power. Ilara felt a strange pang in her chest at the thought, though she could not have explained why the idea of the king marrying bothered her. She had never even seen him, had no connection to him whatsoever, and yet something about the conversation made her feel hollow and sad, in a way that confused her. The massive gilded doors at the far end of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a resonant boom that silenced the chatter instantly. Every head turned as 4 royal guards in ceremonial armor marched through, their boots striking the marble in perfect synchronization. Behind them came King Cassian, and Ilara felt her breath catch in her throat as she got her first glimpse of the man who ruled the entire northern kingdoms. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a powerful build evident even beneath his formal, black and crimson attire. His hair was dark as midnight, slightly too long and falling across a face that could have been carved from stone, all sharp angles and hard lines. But it was his eyes that truly arrested her, pale gray like winter ice, scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed to strip away pretense and see directly into souls. His alpha presence rolled off him in waves so potent that several of the weaker betas near the door actually swayed on their feet, and even the most powerful nobles unconsciously straightened their postures and bowed their heads in instinctive submission. This was not just an alpha. This was the alpha, the apex predator who stood at the top of the entire hierarchy, and every person in the room felt it in their bones. Alara should have looked away, should have dropped her gaze to the floor, as was proper for an Omega in the presence of royalty, but she found herself frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes from him. There was something magnetic about Cassian, something that called to a part of her she had spent her entire life suppressing. She watched as he moved into the ballroom with lethal grace, accepting the bows and curtsies of the assembled nobles with barely a glance, clearly uninterested in their fawning displays. Princess Lyanna rushed forward to greet her brother, her elaborate golden gown rustling as she embraced him with obvious relief and joy. They spoke quietly for a moment, and then Cassian's gaze began to sweep the ballroom more deliberately, as though he were looking for something specific. His eyes moved across clusters of nobles, dismissing them one after another, his expression growing increasingly frustrated. Alara felt a bizarre compulsion to move closer, to step out of the shadows where she had been hovering near the wall, and before she could question the impulse, her feet were carrying her forward through the crowd, drawn by an invisible thread she could not name or resist. She was halfway across the ballroom, moving between a group of chattering beta merchants and a cluster of alpha lords, when Cassian's gaze locked onto her with the force of a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as their eyes met, and Alara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates realigning after centuries of pressure. The bond slammed into her with overwhelming intensity, a golden thread that suddenly became visible in her mind's eye, stretching between her heart and his, pulsing with power and recognition and absolute certainty. Mine, every cell in her body screamed, "Mate, mate, mate!" And she could see in Cassian's widening eyes that he felt it too. The same devastating recognition, the same impossible truth. She was an Omega servant, worthless and invisible, and he was the Alpha King, the most powerful man in the realm, and yet the universe had bound them together as true mates, a pairing so rare that most people lived their entire lives without ever experiencing it. The probability was astronomical, the implications were catastrophic, and neither of them could deny what was happening because the mate bond did not lie, did not make mistakes, and could not be ignored no matter how inconvenient or impossible it might be. The silver tray slipped from Alara's numb fingers and crashed to the marble floor with a sound like breaking thunder, crystal glasses shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces and blood wine spreading across the white stone like spilled rubies. The entire ballroom fell silent, every conversation dying mid-word as hundreds of eyes turned to stare at the clumsy Omega servant who had dared to make such a spectacle. Alara felt her face flush with humiliation, felt the familiar panic rising in her chest as she dropped to her knees to begin gathering the broken glass with shaking hands. She would be punished for this, probably beaten, and definitely denied meals. And she cursed herself for the momentary madness that had made her forget her place. But then she heard footsteps approaching, steady and purposeful, and she looked up to find King Cassian standing directly before her, his towering form blocking out the candlelight and casting her in shadow. Up close, his scent hit her like a narcotic, pine and smoke and something wild and untamed, and she felt her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit, to bare her neck, to acknowledge him as her alpha in the most primal way possible. Cassian extended his hand to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with that same fierce recognition she had seen from across the room. The entire court watched in stunned disbelief as their warrior king, the man who had never shown mercy or softness to anyone, offered his hand to help a servant rise from the floor. Alara stared at that outstretched hand as though it were a venomous snake, knowing that taking it would change everything, that this single moment would define the entire trajectory of her future. She could refuse, could shake her head and scurry away to her servants' quarters and try to pretend this had never happened. But the bond was already singing in her veins, already pulling her toward him with irresistible force, and she knew that running would be as futile as trying to outrun her own shadow. so she placed her small, work-roughened hand in his large, calloused one, and the moment their skin touched, golden light exploded between them, visible to every single person in the ballroom. The unmistakable sign of a true mate bond activating for the first time. Gasps and shocked exclamations rippled through the crowd as Cassian pulled Alara to her feet with effortless strength, and then, before anyone could process what was happening, he turned to face the assembled court with her hand still clasped firmly in his. His voice rang out across the ballroom, deep and commanding and absolutely unshakable. "She is mine, my true mate, my queen." The words hit the nobles like a physical force, and Alara watched in dazed disbelief as the most powerful people in the kingdom began to react. Some faces showed shock, others showed anger, many showed naked calculation as they immediately began to consider how this development affected their own political positions. Princess Lyanna looked genuinely happy, a warm smile spreading across her face as she stepped forward to examine Alara with kind curiosity. But Lord Chancellor Aldrich, an ancient alpha with a face like weathered leather and eyes full of cold intelligence, looked absolutely furious, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as he struggled to maintain his composure. Lady Helena Blackwood, the most powerful noblewoman in court, and someone who had clearly been positioning herself as a potential queen, went pale with rage before quickly schooling her features into a mask of polite interest. Alara could practically see the wheels turning in her mind, already plotting how to undermine or eliminate this unexpected rival. The next few moments would determine whether Alara lived or died, whether she would ascend to heights she had never dreamed possible, or be destroyed by forces far more powerful than herself, and all she could do was stand there with her hand in Cassian's and try not to collapse under the weight of so many hostile stares. If you are enjoying this story of an invisible Omega finding her voice and her power, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment about what you think will happen next. Your support helps us bring you more compelling supernatural romance stories. Lord Chancellor Aldrich was the first to find his voice, stepping forward with carefully measured movements and the expression of paternal concern that did not quite reach his calculating eyes. "Your Majesty, while we are all overjoyed at your return and grateful for your leadership, surely there has been some mistake. This girl is a servant, an Omega of no family or lineage, the mate. Bond is sacred, yes, but perhaps in your exhaustion from the long campaign, you have misinterpreted what you felt. Many young alphas experience strong attractions that they mistake for the true bond." His words were smooth and reasonable, designed to give Cassian a graceful way to walk back his declaration without losing face. But they made Alara's stomach twist with humiliation, because they implied she was merely a passing fancy, a momentary madness that the king would soon regret. She tried to pull her hand from Cassian's, tried to step away and disappear back into the shadows where she belonged, but his grip on her was iron, and he pulled her closer to his side instead, his other hand coming to rest possessively on her lower back. Cassian's expression could have frozen the sun as he stared down the Lord Chancellor with barely restrained fury. "I am not a young alpha prone to flights of fancy, Aldrich. I am your king, and I know my own mate when I find her." Every person in this room saw the bond light activate. "Are you calling me a liar? Or are you simply too blind to see what is directly in front of your face?" His alpha command laced through the words, making several weaker-willed nobles actually take a step backward, and Aldrich's face flushed red with a combination of anger and instinctive submission. But the old alpha had not survived decades of court politics by being easily cowed, and he rallied quickly, his tone becoming more urgent. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I would never question your word. I merely worry about the implications. The Queen must be able to navigate court politics, to form alliances with powerful families, to provide strong heirs to secure the succession. This girl has no training, no education, no understanding of how to rule. She cannot even read or write, I would wager. Choosing her would destabilize the entire kingdom." The words hit Alara like physical blows, because they were all true. She was illiterate. She had no training. She knew nothing about politics or ruling, and the idea of her trying to be queen was laughable. She was setting Cassian up for failure, and she knew it, and the responsible thing would be to walk away before she ruined his reign and destroyed the kingdom in the process. But Cassian's voice was steel wrapped in velvet as he responded, his hand never leaving her back. Then she will learn. My sister managed to serve as regent, despite being only 19 when I left for war. Ilara will have the finest tutors, the best advisors, and she will have me. The mate bond does not make mistakes, Chancellor. The universe chose her for me, and I will not reject that gift because small-minded nobles are too prejudiced to see past her current station. She is mine, and I am hers, and anyone who attempts to separate us or harm her will answer to me personally. Is that clear? The threat in his tone was unmistakable, and Ilara felt a confusing rush of emotions at his unwavering support. Part of her was grateful. Another part was terrified by how much danger he was putting himself in for her sake. And a deeper part that she was almost afraid to acknowledge was thrilled by his possessive declaration, by the way he claimed her so absolutely in front of everyone who had ever dismissed her as worthless. Lady Helena Blackwood glided forward then, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp as knives. Your Majesty, no one questions the mate bond or your right to claim your chosen partner. However, perhaps a compromise might be wise. The girl could be installed as a royal concubine, honored and cherished, but without the political complications of making her queen. You could still take a wife from an appropriate noble family to serve as the public face of the monarchy, while privately enjoying your mate bond. This arrangement has historical precedent and would satisfy both your personal desires and the kingdom's practical needs. Her suggestion was delivered with poisonous sweetness, framing what was essentially a demand that Ilara be hidden away as a dirty secret, while some noble woman took her rightful place. Ilara felt shame burn through her, felt the familiar voice in her head that had always told her she was not good enough, that she should be grateful for whatever scraps she was offered. Maybe Helena was right. Maybe being a hidden concubine was the best she could hope for. The temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop 10 degrees, as Cassian's alpha aura surged outward in a wave of barely controlled rage. His eyes, which had been merely cold before, now burned with fury that made even the most powerful nobles take involuntary steps backward. Lady Blackwood, I will say this once and only once. Ilara is not my concubine, my mistress, or my secret shame. She is my true mate, which makes her your queen whether you like it or not. If you ever suggest again that she should be hidden or diminished, I will personally ensure that your family loses every title, every land holding, and every privilege you currently enjoy. The same goes for anyone else who thinks they can dictate to me how I should honor my mate bond. Am I making myself absolutely clear? His voice cracked through the room like a whip, and Helena actually flinched, her carefully maintained mask of composure slipping to show genuine fear before she quickly dropped into a deep curtsy and murmured an apology. The message had been received by everyone present. Cassian would not be swayed, would not be reasoned with, and would destroy anyone who threatened his mate. Princess Lyanna chose that moment to step forward, breaking the tension with her warm presence and genuine smile. She approached Ilara directly, ignoring protocol to take both of the Omega's hands in her own. Welcome to the family, Ilara. I cannot tell you how happy I am that my brother has finally found his mate. The palace has been far too grim for far too long. We shall have to get you properly dressed and introduced. But first, why do you not tell me a bit about yourself? Where are you from originally? Lyanna's kindness was unexpected and overwhelming, and Ilara found herself blinking back tears as she struggled to respond. I do not know, Your Highness. I was left at an orphanage as an infant. I have no memory of my parents or where I came from. The matron said I was probably the unwanted child of a servant who could not afford to keep me. She sold my contract to the palace when I was 12, and I have been here ever since. The words came out in a rush, her voice barely above a whisper, because she was not accustomed to anyone actually wanting to hear her speak. Lyanna's expression softened with sympathy, and she squeezed Ilara's hands gently. Well, you have a family now, and I suspect there is far more to your story than you know. Unknown parentage for an Omega with a powerful enough bloodline to mate with an Alpha King is quite unusual. We shall have to investigate. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of overwhelming sensations. Cassian refused to let Alara out of his sight, keeping her close to his side as he made his rounds through the ballroom, accepting congratulations and barely veiled threats with equal indifference. Alara could feel the hostility radiating from many of the nobles, could see the calculation in their eyes as they sized her up and found her wanting. She was acutely aware of her plain gray dress, of her work-roughened hands, of the fact that she did not know which fork to use or how to curtsy properly, or what topics were appropriate for polite conversation. Every moment was an exercise in trying not to humiliate herself or Cassian, and the strain of it all left her shaking with exhaustion. Through it all, the mate bond thrummed between them like a living thing, feeding her strength from Cassian's seemingly infinite reserves, connecting them in ways that went beyond physical proximity. She could feel his emotions as though they were her own. His fierce protectiveness, his absolute certainty that she belonged at his side, his rage at anyone who dared to suggest otherwise. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, this connection that bound her to the most powerful man in the kingdom. Finally, as the celebration began to wind down in the early hours of morning, Cassian made their excuses and guided Alara out of the ballroom, his hand never leaving the small of her back. They walked through corridors she had only ever cleaned, past guards who now bowed to her instead of ignoring her, until they reached the royal wing where she had never been permitted to enter. Cassian led her to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire servants' dormitory, furnished with obvious wealth and taste. "These are your rooms now," he said quietly, finally releasing her from his protective hold. "You will not be returning to the servants' quarters. Tomorrow we will begin your education. But tonight you should rest. The bond makes things intense at first, and I do not want to overwhelm you." His consideration surprised her, and she looked up at him with confusion clear on her face. "You are not going to... I thought..." She trailed off, not sure how to articulate what she had assumed would happen, that he would claim her physically as was an Alpha's right with their Omega mate. Cassian's expression softened slightly, the hard edges of his face becoming almost gentle as he reached out to cup her cheek with surprising tenderness. "Alara, I am not going to force you into anything. Yes, you are my mate. And yes, I intend to complete the bond eventually. But that will happen when you are ready, when you want it as much as I do. You have had enough taken from you already. I will not take this too." His words made something crack open in her chest, some frozen place she had not even known existed, and she felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever given her a choice about anything in her entire life, and the fact that he was offering her this, offering her agency and respect and time, was more overwhelming than any of the grand gestures he had made in the ballroom. She leaned into his touch without thinking, craving the comfort and connection that the bond promised, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried against his chest, releasing years of pent-up fear and loneliness and pain. He held her until the tears subsided, murmuring reassurances in her ear, and when he finally pulled back, he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep now, little mate. Tomorrow we begin transforming you into the queen you were always meant to be." Subscribe to our channel for more powerful supernatural romance stories where true mates overcome impossible odds to find their happily ever after. The next several weeks were the most challenging and transformative of Alara's life. True to his word, Cassian arranged for an army of tutors to descend upon her, teaching her everything from basic literacy to advanced politics, from proper etiquette to combat training. Princess Lyanna became an unexpected ally and friend, spending hours each day coaching Alara on how to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, how to identify allies and enemies, how to project confidence even when terrified. The work was exhausting and often frustrating, but Alara discovered that she was far from stupid. She had simply never been given the opportunity to learn. Once that opportunity was provided, she absorbed information like a sponge, her sharp mind making connections that sometimes surprised even her tutors. Reading opened up entire worlds to her, and she spent every spare moment devouring books from the royal library, educating herself on history and law and philosophy. Cassian visited her rooms every evening, spending time talking with her, getting to know her beyond the mate bond, and she found herself falling for him in ways that had nothing to do with biological imperative and everything to do with who he actually was beneath the fearsome reputation. But not everyone was pleased with her progress. The noble families who had hoped to place one of their own daughters on the throne were actively plotting against her, spreading vicious rumors about her past, questioning her fitness to rule, making her life difficult in countless small ways. Lady Helena Blackwood proved to be the most dangerous adversary, using her considerable influence to turn other noble families against Alara, to undermine her at every opportunity. The woman was careful never to do anything overtly treasonous, always maintaining plausible deniability, but her campaign of whispers and subtle sabotage was relentless. Alara found invitations mysteriously lost, found herself seated in positions of dishonor at formal dinners, found her suggestions in council meetings dismissed or ridiculed. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, designed to break her spirit and make her give up, to prove that she was indeed unworthy of her position. The worst incident came during a formal state dinner with visiting dignitaries from the Eastern Kingdoms. Alara had been practicing protocol for weeks, determined to make Cassian proud, but as she rose to give a formal toast, someone had loosened the leg of her chair, and she fell backward in a graceless sprawl, her wine glass flying from her hand and drenching the visiting ambassador. The entire room erupted in shocked silence, and then barely suppressed laughter as Alara scrambled to her feet, her face burning with humiliation. She could see Lady Helena's satisfied smile, could see Lord Chancellor Aldrich shaking his head, as though this confirmed everything he had warned about. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the words stuck in her throat as shame and anger warred within her. This was exactly what they wanted, to humiliate her publicly and prove she did not belong, and she had played right into their hands. But then Cassian was there, moving to her side with lethal grace and helping her to her feet with exquisite gentleness. His alpha aura rolled out across the room like a tidal wave, silencing the laughter instantly and making every person present feel the weight of his displeasure. "It seems we have a saboteur in our midst," he said quietly, his voice carrying effortlessly through the sudden silence. "Someone thought it would be amusing to tamper with the Queen's chair, to embarrass her in front of our guests. This is not merely an insult to my mate, it is an insult to me, to the crown, and to the entire kingdom. The person responsible will confess now, or I will have every servant and noble in this room questioned under truth spell until the culprit is revealed." His threat was not empty, and Alara watched as a young beta nobleman, clearly one of Helena's lackeys, went pale and began to shake. The man obviously had not expected such severe consequences for what he thought was a harmless prank, and he stammered out a confession, implicating himself but carefully avoiding mentioning who had put him up to it. Cassian's expression was carved from ice as he listened to the confession. "You will spend the next month in the palace dungeons reflecting on your actions. And you?" He turned to address Lady Helena directly, meeting her shocked gaze with implacable determination. "Will remember that attempting to harm or embarrass my mate is the same as attempting to harm or embarrass me. If I discover you are behind any future incidents, your entire family will face treason charges. Am I clear?" Helena's face went through a fascinating series of expressions before settling on forced contrition as she curtsied deeply and murmured assurances of her loyalty. But Alara could see the hatred burning in the woman's eyes, could see that this public reprimand had only made her more dangerous, more determined to see Alara destroyed. The evening continued with forced normalcy, but Alara could not shake the feeling that she had just made an enemy who would stop at nothing to see her removed from her position, one way or another. That night, alone in her rooms after the disastrous dinner, Alara finally broke down completely. She dismissed her attendants and collapsed onto her bed, sobbing into her pillows with the force of weeks of accumulated stress and fear. She had been fooling herself thinking she could do this, thinking she could transform from a servant into a queen. She was making Cassian look weak by association, was making him fight battles he should not have to fight, was turning his court into a war zone. The responsible thing, the loving thing, would be to leave, to disappear back into obscurity, and let him find a proper mate from a noble family who could actually help him rule, instead of being a constant liability. She was so lost in her misery that she did not hear the door open, did not realize she was no longer alone, until Cassian's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest and holding her while she cried. He did not tell her to stop, did not try to minimize her pain with empty reassurances. He simply held her and let her break apart, offering his strength and his presence as an anchor in the storm of her emotions. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her exhausted and empty, Cassian tilted her face up to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were soft with understanding, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "You are thinking about leaving," he said quietly, and it was not a question. "You are thinking that I would be better off without you, that you are a burden I should not have to bear." Ilara could not meet his gaze, could not deny the accusation because it was true, but Cassian's hand was gentle but insistent as he forced her to look at him. "Listen to me very carefully, little mate. You are not a burden. You are not a liability. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that to you if necessary. Do you know what I was before I found you? I was a weapon, a tool of the state, something to be pointed at enemies and unleashed. I won battles and conquered territories, but I was empty inside, going through the motions of ruling without ever feeling truly alive. You change that. You make me want to be more than just a warrior king. You make me want to build something beautiful instead of just destroying things. So do not talk about leaving. Do not talk about being unworthy, because you are the most valuable thing in this entire kingdom, and anyone who cannot see that is a fool." His words crashed over her like a wave, washing away some of the doubt and fear that had been drowning her. She searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that he was simply trying to make her feel better, but all she saw was raw honesty and fierce devotion. The mate bond pulsed between them, stronger now than it had been in the ballroom, and she realized that over the past weeks of spending time together, talking and learning about each other, they had been building something that went beyond biological imperative. She was falling in love with him, deeply and irrevocably, and the terrifying truth was that he seemed to be falling just as hard for her. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, pouring everything she could not articulate into that single kiss. Cassian responded, immediately, his arms tightening around her as he deepened the kiss, and for the first time since the disastrous dinner, Ilara felt something other than despair. She felt hope and desire, and the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. The kiss led to more, inhibitions falling away as the mate bond urged them toward completion. Cassian was gentle despite his fearsome reputation, taking his time to worship every inch of her, making sure she felt cherished and safe and wanted. When they finally came together fully, completing the mate bond in the most intimate way possible, Ilara felt something fundamental click into place inside her, like a puzzle piece she had not known was missing, suddenly filling a void she had carried her entire life. The bond flared golden between them, visible even in the dim lamplight, and she felt their souls intertwining in ways that transcended physical pleasure. Afterwards, lying tangled together in her bed with his arms, wrapped protectively around her, Ilara finally felt like she had come home. This was where she belonged, with this complicated, fierce, devoted man who saw value in her when no one else ever had. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that made all the difference. The next morning, Ilara woke to find sunlight streaming through the windows and Cassian already awake, propped on one elbow and watching her with an expression of such contentment that it made her heart ache. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How do you feel?" She took inventory of herself, noting the pleasant soreness in her body, the unprecedented sense of completion and peace in her mind, and smiled up at him. "I feel like I can take on anything," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. The completed mate bond seemed to have given her access to Cassian's strength and confidence, fortifying her in ways that went beyond physical. He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his severe face into something almost boyish. Good, because we have a full council meeting today, and I want you there, voicing your opinions and taking your rightful place as my partner in ruling this kingdom. His confidence in her was simultaneously terrifying and empowering, but she found herself nodding, determination replacing the despair of the night before. The council meeting was every bit as challenging as Alara had feared. The council table was surrounded by powerful alphas and betas, most of whom viewed her presence as an insult to their positions. Lord Chancellor Aldrich looked particularly displeased to see her taking the seat at Cassian's right hand, a position that had been vacant for years. But Cassian made it clear from the outset that Alara was not merely a decorative presence, that her input would be valued and considered. The discussion turned to taxation policies in the newly conquered southern territories, with several council members advocating for harsh measures that would extract maximum resources with no regard for the well-being of the conquered people. Alara listened to the proposals with growing unease, remembering her own experiences with poverty and oppression, and before she could talk herself out of it, she spoke up. "Excuse me, but would it not be wiser to implement moderate taxation that allows the southern territories to prosper? If we crush them with excessive demands, we will create resentment and rebellion. But if we help them rebuild and thrive, they will become loyal and productive parts of the kingdom." The room fell silent as every eye turned to stare at her, many expressions openly hostile at her presumption in contradicting their established strategies. Lord Aldrich's lip curled with barely concealed contempt. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, ruling a kingdom is not the same as managing a household. These decisions require experience and understanding of complex economics and politics that you simply do not possess. Your intentions may be kind, but kindness does not win wars or fill coffers." His dismissal was couched in polite language, but the message was clear. Sit down, be quiet, and let your betters make decisions. But Cassian leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered Alara's words. "Actually, my mate makes an excellent point. We spent 3 years and countless lives conquering the southern territories. If we now spend the next decade putting down rebellions because we bled them dry with taxation, what exactly have we gained? Perhaps a lighter touch, as the Queen suggests, would serve us better in the long run." His support silenced the immediate objections, though Alara could see several council members exchanging dark looks, clearly displeased that their new king was actually listening to his Omega mate. The discussion continued, with Alara gradually gaining confidence to offer more suggestions, some of which were adopted, and others which were rejected, but always with reasoned debate rather than dismissal. By the end of the meeting, she had earned at least a grudging respect from a few of the more open-minded council members, and she felt like she had taken a small but significant step toward proving her worth. Over the following months, Alara settled into her role with increasing confidence. She discovered that her years as a servant, invisible and overlooked, had given her unique insights into how the kingdom actually functioned at ground level. She knew things that the nobles had never seen, understood problems that they dismissed as insignificant, and she used that knowledge to propose reforms that improved life for the kingdom's most vulnerable citizens. She established programs to feed orphans, to provide education for servant children, to protect Omegas from abuse by their alpha employers. Not all of her initiatives were popular with the nobility, many of whom resented the costs and the erosion of their traditional privileges, but Cassian supported her unfailingly, backing her proposals with his authority and making it clear that his queen's projects were his projects. But the political situation was growing more dangerous. Lady Helena had not given up her vendetta, and she had found an ally in Lord Aldrich, who was becoming increasingly concerned about Cassian's progressive policies and Alara's growing influence. The two of them, along with several other conservative nobles, began to meet in secret, plotting how to remove Alara from power and restore what they viewed as proper order. Alara became aware of these meetings through whispered warnings from servants loyal to her. people who remembered her kindness when she had been one of them. She brought the information to Cassian, expecting him to immediately move against the conspirators, but he surprised her with his restraint. "We need proof before we can act," he explained. "If we move against powerful nobles based on rumors and speculation, we risk looking paranoid and tyrannical. We need to catch them in an act of actual treason, something undeniable." His patience frustrated her, but she understood the political calculus, and so they waited, watching and gathering evidence while pretending ignorance of the plot forming against them. The conspirators finally made their move during a grand hunt in the royal forest, a traditional autumn event that brought together nobles from across the kingdom. Ilara had been reluctant to attend, uncomfortable with the idea of killing animals for sport, but Cassian had insisted that she needed to be seen participating in traditional royal activities. The hunt began at dawn, with dozens of riders spreading out through the forest in pursuit of deer and wild boar. Ilara was not a skilled rider, and she struggled to keep up with the main group, eventually finding herself separated from the others as her horse followed a diverging path. She was trying to figure out how to rejoin the main hunt when arrows began to whistle through the trees, striking the ground around her horse's hooves. Her mount panicked and reared, throwing her from the saddle and sending her crashing to the forest floor. She hit hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs and leaving her stunned and gasping. Through blurred vision, she saw masked figures emerging from the underbrush, 4 of them surrounding her with weapons drawn. One stepped forward, and even through the mask she recognized the build and bearing of Lord Aldrich. "Such a tragic hunting accident," he said coldly. The young queen, inexperienced rider that she is, thrown from her horse and trampled. No one will be surprised, and the kingdom can finally return to proper order under a king who is not distracted by an inappropriate mate bond. He raised his sword, clearly intending to finish her quickly, but before he could strike, a roar of pure rage echoed through the forest, and Cassian exploded from the tree line in full alpha fury. His transformation was terrifying and magnificent, his eyes glowing with inner fire as his alpha aura blazed out like a physical force. The masked conspirators actually staggered backward under the weight of it, their courage evaporating in the face of his wrath. Cassian moved with inhuman speed, disarming and incapacitating 3 of the assassins before they could even react. Aldrich tried to run, but Cassian caught him easily, slamming him against a tree trunk with enough force to crack. "The bark! You dare!" Cassian snarled, his voice barely recognizable as human. "You dare to lay hands on my mate, on your queen. The only reason you are still breathing is because I want you alive to face justice for your treason." His fist connected with Aldrich's face with brutal precision, breaking the old alpha's nose and sending blood streaming down his front. Cassian hit him twice more, venting his rage through violence, before finally stepping back and letting the broken man crumple to the ground. Royal guards appeared then, drawn by the commotion, and Cassian ordered them to secure all 4 prisoners and take them to the palace dungeons. Then he turned to Ilara, his fury melting into concern as he knelt beside her and gathered her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her body checking for injuries. She was bruised and shaken, but nothing was broken, and she clung to him as delayed shock set in, trembling against his chest as the reality of how close she had come to death crashed over her. The trial of the conspirators was held publicly, with the entire court assembled to witness justice being served. The evidence was overwhelming. Lady Helena and Lord Aldrich had left a trail of correspondence and bribed servants that made their guilt undeniable. Helena broke under questioning, confessing to multiple attempts on Ilara's life and admitting that she had hoped to eliminate the Omega Queen and position herself as Cassian's proper mate. Aldrich remained defiant to the end, insisting that he had been trying to save the kingdom from ruin by removing an unworthy queen. The sentence for treason was death, but Cassian surprised everyone by offering a choice. He stripped both conspirators of all titles, lands, and wealth, reducing them to the same poverty and powerlessness that they had inflicted on so many others. They could accept exile to the frozen northern wastelands, where they would live out their days as commoners, or they could choose execution. It was a mercy neither of them deserved, but Cassian wanted to demonstrate that his reign would not be defined by bloodshed and revenge. Both chose exile, perhaps hoping they would find a way to return someday. But Cassian made it clear that setting foot in his kingdom again would result in immediate execution. With the main conspirators dealt with, the opposition to Alara crumbled. The nobles who had been willing to whisper and scheme suddenly became models of loyalty and support, at least publicly. Alara knew that many of them still resented her, but open defiance had become impossible after seeing what happened to those who plotted against the crown. She used her newfound security to push through even more aggressive reforms, establishing councils that included Omega representatives, creating laws that protected the vulnerable from exploitation, redistributing wealth from corrupt nobles to fund public services. Each change met with resistance, but Cassian's unflagging support and the raw power of the mate bond made her unstoppable. She was becoming the queen she had never imagined she could be, not through politics or lineage, but through genuine care for her people and willingness to fight for those without power. But the greatest revelation came 6 months after the assassination attempt, when Alara began experiencing strange symptoms. She was tired all the time, prone to sudden dizziness, and her Omega senses seemed heightened to an almost painful degree. The royal physician confirmed what she had started to suspect. She was pregnant with Cassian's child. The news sent the court into a frenzy of excitement and anxiety. An heir would solidify the succession and prove the validity of the controversial match, but the pregnancy also made Alara vulnerable. As she began to show, strange things started happening around her. Plants in the royal gardens bloomed out of season when she walked past. Servants who were ill found themselves mysteriously healed after she touched them. The mate bond between her and Cassian seemed to pulse with power that neither of them fully understood. Princess Lyanna became obsessed with researching Alara's mysterious background, convinced that these manifestations of power were the key to understanding who she really was. What she discovered in the oldest archives of the royal library was shocking. There had been, centuries ago, a bloodline of Omega healers called the Star Weavers, who possessed incredible magical abilities. They had been systematically hunted down and eliminated during a period of alpha supremacy. Their powers feared, and their bloodlines supposedly wiped out. But what if one branch of the family had survived, hidden among common servants and orphans, their heritage forgotten but not truly gone? The timing matched, the abilities matched, and when Lyanna performed a genealogical spell on a lock of Alara's hair, the results confirmed it. Alara was the last living descendant of the Starweaver line, an Omega of ancient power who had been living as a servant, because no one had known what she really was. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, Alara's match with the Alpha King made perfect sense, according to the old bloodline theories. Power called to power, and the strongest Alpha would naturally be drawn to the strongest Omega. The nobles who had questioned her worth were forced to confront the reality that she came from a lineage even older and more prestigious than most of their families. But more importantly, Alara finally understood the strange sense of disconnection she had always felt, the way she had made herself invisible, not through mere survival instinct, but through unconscious magical shielding. She began to work with mages to unlock her dormant abilities, to learn how to wield the healing and protective magic that was her birthright. The process was difficult and sometimes painful, like stretching muscles that had never been used. But as her powers awakened, she became even more formidable. The test of her newfound abilities came sooner than anyone expected. A plague swept through the capital city, a magical illness that seemed to target Omegas specifically, causing fever and wasting that killed within days. The royal physicians were helpless, unable to even slow the disease's progression. Dozens died within the first week, and panic began to spread as people realized that no cure existed. Alara watched the death toll rise with growing horror, feeling useless and frustrated. Then one night, as she lay in bed with her hand resting on her growing belly, she felt something click into place inside her, like a door opening to reveal a room full of light. She understood, suddenly and completely, that she could heal this plague. not through medicine or conventional magic, but through the ancient Starweaver abilities that flowed through her veins. She just needed to be brave enough to try. Despite Cassian's protests and fears for her safety, Alara insisted on going to the plague wards. She walked among the dying, laying her hands on each patient and letting her healing magic flow through her into them. The power was immense and draining, golden light pouring from her palms as she knit together damaged tissues and burned away the plague's corruption. She worked for hours, healing dozens of patients, pushing herself far beyond what was safe. The effort it required was staggering, and by the time she finished with the last patient, she was swaying on her feet, her face pale and her hands trembling. Cassian caught her as she collapsed, gathering her into his arms and carrying her back to the palace while she drifted in and out of consciousness. She had saved hundreds of lives, but nearly killed herself in the process. And as she lay recovering over the next several days, she understood that her power was both a gift and a responsibility that she could not take lightly. The plague healing cemented Alara's position in ways that political maneuvering never could have. The people of the capital, Omega and Alpha alike, began to speak of their queen with reverence and genuine love. She was not just a servant who had married up. She was their protector, their healer, someone who risked her own life to save theirs. Songs were written about her, children were named after her, and temples began to include prayers for her health alongside prayers for the king. The nobles who had dismissed her as unworthy were forced to acknowledge that she possessed power and value that none of their pampered daughters could match. She had proven herself in the most fundamental way possible, through sacrifice and service to her people. If this story of transformation and finding your true power resonates with you, please share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. The birth of their son, 9 months after that night when the mate bond had been completed, was an event, celebrated throughout the entire kingdom. Prince Damien was born healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gentle eyes. And the moment Alara held him for the first time, she felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. But the baby was special in ways that became apparent almost immediately. When he cried, small objects in the room would float, responding to his distress. When Alara nursed him, the mate bond would pulse with golden light, and Cassian swore he could feel his son's presence through the connection, like a third thread joining them. The royal mages confirmed what they had suspected. Damien had inherited both his father's alpha power and his mother's Starweaver abilities, a combination that had never been documented in any historical record. He would grow to be something entirely new, a bridge between the Alpha and Omega powers that had been kept separate for so long. Raising a child while ruling a kingdom proved to be its own unique challenge. Alara discovered that being a mother and a queen required constant balance, never quite succeeding fully at either role but doing her best with both. Cassian proved to be a devoted father, often found in the nursery at odd hours, holding his son and talking to him about everything and nothing. The fierce warrior king became gentle in those moments, revealing layers of himself that few people ever got to see. Alara would sometimes watch them together and feel overwhelmed by gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her from invisibility to this, a family she could call her own, a partner who valued her, a son who would never know the loneliness and worthlessness she had once accepted as her entire existence. But the kingdom's transformation was far from complete. There was still so much work to do, so many injustices to correct, so many systems that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. Alara threw herself into the work with the same determination she had brought to healing the plague. Using her position and power to create lasting change, she established the first Omega College, where those born to her designation could receive education and training that had previously been denied to them. She reformed the servant contracts, eliminating the practice of selling children into bondage, and ensuring that all workers received fair wages and protections. She created councils in every major city that included representation from all designations, not just alphas and betas. Each reform was a battle, requiring political skill and sometimes the threat of Cassian's royal authority to overcome entrenched opposition. But slowly, painfully, the kingdom began to change. 5 years after that night in the ballroom, when their eyes had first met across a sea of hostile nobles, Alara stood on the palace balcony looking out over the capital city and reflected on how much had transformed. She was no longer the invisible servant girl who had believed herself worthless. She was Queen Alara Starweaver, healer, reformer, mother, and mate to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. She had discovered that her value had never been determined by what others saw in her, but by what she chose to see in herself. The journey had been hard, filled with pain and fear and moments where she had wanted to give up. But she had persevered, and in doing so had helped transform not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had been invisible and dismissed just as she once was. Cassian came to stand beside her on the balcony, their son balanced on his hip, and babbling happily about something only a 5-year-old would find important. He wrapped his free arm around her waist and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. Alara leaned into his warmth, feeling the mate bond humming contentedly between them, and smiled. "I am thinking about how a single moment can change everything. How looking up when I should have looked down led me here. How being seen by the right person can transform you into someone you never knew you could be." Cassian's arm tightened around her, and she felt his love and pride flowing through the bond like a physical caress. "You transformed yourself, my queen. I simply had the wisdom to recognize what was already there." She laughed softly and turned in his arms to kiss him properly, their son squealing with delight between them. The epilogue of their story was written, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of days turned into years. They ruled together for decades, raising not just Damien but 3 more children, each one unique and powerful in their own ways. Alara's reforms slowly spread beyond their kingdom, as other realms saw the prosperity and stability that came from treating all designations with dignity and respect. The Starweaver bloodline was restored to prominence, with Alara establishing schools to help other Omegas with latent magical abilities discover and develop their powers. Cassian remained her unwavering partner and protector, his fierce love never dimming, despite the passage of time and the challenges they faced. They were not a perfect couple. They fought and disagreed and sometimes hurt each other the way any 2 people in a long relationship inevitably do. But they always came back together, always chose each other, always worked through their problems with honesty and commitment. On their 20th anniversary, Cassian organized a ball that deliberately echoed that first night when they had met. The ballroom was filled with nobles and commoners alike, all designations represented and honored equally in ways that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Alara wore a gown of midnight blue that complemented Cassian's formal attire, and as they opened the dancing together, she looked around at the faces watching them and saw respect and genuine affection, instead of the hostility and dismissal that had greeted her so many years ago. She had earned her place through hard work and sacrifice, through compassion and strength, through refusing to be invisible even when invisibility was easier. She had transformed from a servant no one wanted into a queen everyone needed, and in doing so had proven that worth was not something given by others, but something claimed for yourself. As the music swelled, and Cassian spun her across the dance floor with practiced ease, Alara caught sight of her reflection in one of the ballroom's many mirrors. The woman looking back at her was confident and regal, dressed in finest silks and crowned with delicate jewels, but her eyes held the same gentle determination that had defined the servant girl she had once been. She had not lost herself in her transformation. She had simply become more fully who she always had the potential to be, and perhaps that was the real magic, not the healing powers or the mate, bond, or the royal title, but the simple truth that everyone, no matter how invisible or dismissed or looked down upon, possessed inherent worth and the capacity for greatness, if only they were given the chance to bloom. She had been given that chance, and she had seized it with both hands, and now she spent her life ensuring that others received the same opportunities she had. That, she thought, as Cassian pulled her close and whispered words of love in her ear, was the real happily ever after. Not a perfect ending, but a life of purpose and meaning, shared with someone who saw you, truly saw you, for exactly who you were.